video.
Good, it'll be good. So that means I just knocked off 10 years off of my loan. Dropped dropped almost 2 points on the interest rate. So basically, I dropped
Still
10
people
years.
coming in.
Now it's $20. I don't even know what it is. I don't even know who it is. So I'm
All right, guys. As everybody is entering here, I'd like to start welcoming everybody to today's talk. This is the History Has Eyes on You 4. And so the name of this talk specifically is Teaching and Learning with Mass Pedagogy in a White Educational System. And give me a second because they're still coming. We're sending Eliza here to help me admit everybody. But yeah, so we really are going to have a packed house tonight. And I'd like to thank you guys for joining us today for this talk. And my name is Christopher Carmona. I'm going to be moderating this panel. And today we have 4 great speakers who are going to be talking about Mas and ethnic studies and the importance of teaching and education of Mexican American Latinx histories and stories throughout Latinx and Indigenous pedagogies. We're going to look at from the history of schooling for Mexican Americans through escuelitas to the current teaching of Mexican American school studies in public schools. And we're also going to look at, and we're going to start with talking about the role and importance of ethnic studies via educational policy and the act of practicing public history through oral history and teaching of oral history with our students here. So one more second while we have more people coming in. So this series is sponsored by the press, the Jade Press. So Jade Publishing is a small press publishing company that has several media outlets. One of them is Latino Book Review, and the Jade Publishing itself publishes international works. They publish trilingual works. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you so you guys can see. And see. So this is Jade Publishing, and they publish numerous titles from children's books to my work in multiple languages: Spanish, Nahuatl, even Mayan. And they published it in trilingually, and they also published my book, my books as well. And so they do a lot of different work. They also work in promoting a podcast, talking with different authors and scholars. We have one coming out with Kelly Lytle Hernandez that they're going to be launching pretty soon. And also Latino Book Review, which covers a lot of and interviews with lots of authors and scholars as well. And they have been sponsoring this since we had our first one. And so this press has been doing a lot of work to promote and keep these conversations going through publications, through these talks, and through podcasts and other things. So they're really growing, and they're doing a great job with this. So I would really advise you guys to go take a look at their website and look at their books, because they publish some really interesting works here, and in all aspects. But this is the sponsor for tonight. As myself, I'm going to be moderating this panel, and so I'm going to go ahead and start going through with introducing our speakers tonight. Our first speaker is going to be speaking on the state of ethnic studies, the ever-changing world of ethnic studies in our current cultural and political society. And this talk will discuss the fight for ethnic studies and the impact it has on educators and students. So I want to go ahead and welcome let's see here, Angela Valenzuela, who will be Go ahead and spotlight you.
Okay, good to go.
So give me 1 second while I bring up your bio. um, so Angela Valenzuela is a professor in the Department of Curriculum Instruction and the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Texas at Austin. She is director of the Texas Center for Educational Policy. Previously, she taught in the Department of Sociology at Rice University, and she was a visiting scholar at the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Houston. She completed her PhD at Stanford University and is the author of the award-winning book Subtractive Schooling, U.S.-Mexico Youth and the Politics of Caring, Leaving Children Behind, How Texas-Style Accountability Fails Latino Youth, Growing Critically Conscious Teachers, a Social Justice Curriculum for Educators and of Latino Youth, which is a really great resource. And she also has founded and operates an educational blog titled Educational Equity, Politics, and Policy in Texas. So I want to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Valenzuela.
Thank you, Dr. Carmona. I'm so happy to be, and very honored to be opening up this this conference. And I'm excited to hear what my colleagues have to share. This is an exciting time for ethnic studies. And so I think what would be really good for this audience is just to kind of know the landscape and, well, what is ethnic studies? And it's an umbrella term. It's the term for robust, often I would say cutting edge interdisciplinary fields of study. In Texas, that's typically Mexican American studies, African American studies, Native American and Indigenous studies, and Asian American studies. In other places, like on the East Coast, maybe in Florida, you would find Boricua, Puerto Rican studies. There could be Dominican studies, but the idea is that we are located intellectually from a scholarly perspective, from a student perspective in fields of studies, fields that are at least 50 years old by now. And Mexican American studies often is also called Chicana or Chicano studies because it comes out of the Chicano studies movement. I myself am a sociologist. My area is sociology of education, race and ethnic relations. But I've always been, for many, many years now, been an affiliate, a proud affiliate of Mexican American studies. I'm also an affiliate of Native American studies at UT. Conceptually, ethnic studies could be accompanied with women and gender studies or LGBTQ studies, but also ethnic studies itself, maybe not in every class, but in a lot of classes, at least the idea is to not only be interdisciplinary, but intersectional, right? Looking at different intersections of difference, so that it's not just all about ethnicity, but it could be even more complicated than that in terms of other statuses like class, gender, sexual orientation, or even within ethnicity, other representations having to do with Afro-Indigeneity, Afro-Latino, and the like. The university level, ethnic studies is typically located in liberal arts, in the humanities or social sciences, but it could also still connect to STEM fields and STEM careers, such as like in the growing field of ethnomathematics and ethno-environmental sciences, for example. There's a really, really exciting area of research and practice right now out of San Antonio primarily that involves Dean Belinda Flores and Dean Dr. Lorena Gleis, and they're implementing in San Antonio ISD schools Mayan mathematics. This is a good example of ethnomathematics, the Nepoaltzitzin. It's a Mayan abacus. It's pre-Columbian that our ancestors used to build pyramids and great cities, and it's just extraordinary to have that as like something that would be part of ethnic studies. And as it turns out, kids perform well and they acquire a love of math, and it's It's enriching intellectually and otherwise because it's also cultural. At the K-12 level, K through 12th grade, ethnic study was historically referred to as multicultural education. So probably some of you have heard that phrase. Well, it's really the same idea, and the same thing. And ethnic studies is used today, but it stands for that, and it can have three different representations. There may be others, but these are the three of which I am aware. And so one would be an infusion approach, and that's where you have a course. It could be like social studies, it could be fine arts, and the idea is you infuse like culturally relevant pedagogies, or ethnic studies or multicultural education into the curriculum. So you infuse it. Then there's also the comparative thematic approach where you have like across ethnic groups thematic content that might align, for example, to heritage months. So that's what we have in the Austin Independent School District is a comparative thematic approach. That exists also because of our advocacy at the grassroots level. We in our community-based organization, Nuestro Grupo, we went to the school board and we said, hey, school board, and we had a champion on the board. And you could do this too, find a champion and get on the agenda and then ask your school board members to implement ethnic studies. And they might even ask you to sit on the curriculum development team if you're a teacher and it's something that you're already doing, or maybe you could just volunteer to do that. That would be wonderful. There's also single group studies, and that's where you have the individual ethnic studies courses taught. And those align to fields of study that I've already mentioned, Mexican American studies. That is what we passed at the state level, is this kind of approach where we have single group studies, and the rationale, I think is straightforward, that we have just so much knowledge production, and we have a community that is so large that we're in the K-12 system, over 50% of all students in K-12 in the state of Texas. And so it also stands to reason, based on demographics, that we would offer Mexican American studies. And I think any of these studies could be part of like a gateway, right? An approach, a pathway into any of the other ethnic studies alternatives if they're available. And hopefully they are. Hopefully someday all of this is just going to be called a good education, okay? I trust. So the single group approach was that which we pursued as a coalition, and this includes people you see here, the National Association for Chicano Studies Texas-Poco community, and that has its own history. We can't go into all of it right now. There's actually an article in Remezcla that just came out that was written by Maribel Falcon. Dr. Carmona, maybe you could make it available to everybody. That does a pretty good job for a news piece to capture the the dynamics and the politics, and what were the factors that resulted in a real victory before the Texas State Board of Education. When they approved in 2016 these different areas of study, Mexican American, Native American, Asian American, and African American studies. It's historic, and it reflects what some of us call dismantling the colonial matrix of power, is a concept that I'm using in my own word, because it's, we inherit the structures of colonialism, and even when they go away, we reinscribe them, right? We replicate them just because it's the air that we breathe. And it doesn't occur to us that we can actually question the sacred cow of curriculum and discover that it's not that sacred after all, that, people got, like ourselves, got around a table, some years ago, and they made decisions that at the time they felt were good for the state, but which also had an agenda to very clearly. All curriculum reflects the wishes of people, and the people that are involved that are dominant in society have an uneven or undue impact on that. And it's something that we see every time when the history standards come up, and then we come before and ask for inclusion, like we'll include Dolores Huerta, include Cesar Chavez, the Battle of Medina, etc. And then we always just get a sliver of everything that we request. And it really wasn't until 2014, and it was following the struggle, and it was actually concurrent as well with the struggle in Arizona, where Mexican American Studies was dismantled in the Tucson Unified School District because the state was discriminated and expressed racial animus toward the teachers in the MAS program, whose students were not only performing at a high level, but they were outperforming students in the regular curriculum. It seems like we get the notice of people when we achieve, and so much less notice when we do not achieve. And that's part of the colonial matrix of power, these expectations that are just that are really systemic, right? And they're racist, and they're classist, and they're anti-Mexican. And that's layered over a long history that's even longer, but we're never taught it, about indigeneity. And it's as if history begins with 1848, when really the biggest part of our story is everything that comes before that. So we struggle. We have ensured that that we would make progress on this agenda through our unity, our motivation, and I think it's that combination, as Dr. Bambi Cárdenas once shared with me, that what really motivates us as a community, and I believe this is true, is that intersection of culture and language and education is our historic vehicle through which we achieve not only the American dream, but we achieve liberation through through the curriculum and the knowledge that nourishes our beings, right? And so, the obverse is not a pretty picture. The obverse is that the social studies curriculum, it doesn't even come in, the word social studies doesn't even come into existence until the Native American boarding experience, which speaks to the colonial agenda. It was not to enfranchise at all Native peoples. It was quite the opposite. It was to teach a certain version of history to which they would have to assimilate. And when we think of assimilation, we should think of forced assimilation. We should think of violence and symbolic violence, and how what we have as a framework is predicated on these violent systems, right? And they're violent because they ask you to, as part of learning, to leave out huge parts of yourself, your language, your culture, your identity, your familia, your community, your social issues. If all of that is what is part of the bargain, which we're not like empowered to really have any say so over generally, unless we speak up, then this is a land of dispossession. This is like, you can't defeat a people with a history. And so that's what this is about. And that speaks to the importance of historical struggles. As far as policy, what we need to do is, and we are working on this, to make ethnic studies a graduation requirement from high school. There's a lot of detail there. We need teachers to teach ethnic studies. I'm aware that one state representative out of Houston, Cristina Morales, wants to set up an ethnic study commission. We're hoping to talk to her soon about what she might envision, but we can imagine just the full range of topics that would be important, that would have to do with accreditation, like testing, and how does it interface with testing. We're also trying to ameliorate high stakes testing, by the way. So that's like another agenda. But I'll stop there. I think there's a lot of questions you might have, and but these are very important policy directions that I'm so proud that we're taking as a state. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you for that presentation. And now I want to go ahead and call up or ask, excuse me, bring up Phyllis Barrigan Getz, and she is going to be speaking on escuelitas, and she's going to give a brief overview of Escuelita history in South Texas, discussing its connection to progressivism, modernization, the expansion of the public school system, the Mexican Revolution, and the rise of the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. She argues that Escuelitas, within the context of these historical developments, illustrates not only the salience of education to ethnic Mexican communities, but also the ways in which those same communities use education as a vehicle for cultural negotiation. So I'm going to welcome Phyllis Barrigan Getz. She is received her PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. She is an assistant professor of history at Texas A&M San Antonio, where she teaches classes in Mexican American history, women's history, Texas history, and United States social and cultural history. She is also Texas A&M San Antonio's community liaison to the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, and a co-coordinator for the Women and Gender Studies program. Her book, Reading, Writing Revolution, Escuelitas, and the Emergence of a Mexican American Identity in Texas, has been published by the University of Texas Press in spring 2020. So let's go ahead and welcome Phyllis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. And thanks so much to Chris for organizing this and for asking me to be on the panel. So I like to start, one of the first things I want to talk about is, sorry if you can hear that, that's my mom calling me. So one of the things that I'd like to do is define how I define escuelita in my work. So escuelita literally translates to little schools, right? And the term, it's a generic term really, and it's used to refer to a broad base of community schools. And in all the research that I did, I categorized them into, sorry, that's my mom, she will just call, she'll call it. So I categorize them into two categories, informal and formal, is how I refer to them. So the informal escuelitas were exactly that. Like they weren't trying to take the place of the public school system. They didn't even have their own building. Oftentimes it would be a woman in the neighborhood who would open up her home to the neighborhood children. If the parents paid anything, it was a really small fee. And then you have more formal escuelitas, which in a sense did replace they did attempt to replace the public school system because they operated during the regular school day. Whereas the more informal ones, children could go to the public school and attend an informal escuelita as an after school program or during the summer. But the more formal ones, they had their own building. And oftentimes the fact, like the very existence of the building itself spoke to the way that the community came together in the name of education for their children. So you would have somebody who would own a plot of land and donate the plot of land, and then somebody else might donate, materials like lumber or bricks, nails, something like that. And then you have a number of people donating their time and their labor in the sense that they're actually the ones that are building the school. But there are a couple of characteristics I found that unify these two types of escuelitas. And the first one, and Angela was just speaking about this, is the curriculum, right? So in the pre-World War II period, escuelitas pretty much almost always had Spanish as the language of instruction. And the curriculum was just really the polar opposite of the Americanization and Anglo-centric curriculum of the public school system. Because in the escuelitas, they taught Spanish literacy, Mexican history, Mexican cultural traditions, oftentimes things like Mexican poetry, art, sewing, things like that. And the second characteristic I found that unites these two types of escuelitas is the fact that they both grew out of multiple grassroots movements. That this is what makes escuelitas a phenomenon, right? Because there's not any one organization or government agency or any kind of large body overseeing their development and organizing their development, right? That's not happening. It's it's really coming from the community, from ethnic Mexicans, referring to Mexican Americans, attempts to educate their children in response to various obstacles that are time and place specific. And so I'm gonna screen share.
Mhm.
I wanna show you guys a map. There we go. So this is a map of that documents. This map is compiled based from all of the research that I've done. So it plots the locations of all the escuelitas for which I could find concrete evidence. Keep in mind though that like in Laredo, for example, there's one dot, right? But I found quite a bit of evidence that points to escuelitas in Laredo. So in 1892, there's a superintendent's report where the superintendent of the Laredo public school system wrote, there's 40, of course he called them Spanish language schools. There's 40 Spanish language schools in the city, right? So of course I don't know the names or where, so just keep in mind that while there might be one dot in a place, there's probably a very long history behind that dot. And so I want to show you guys a couple of an example. Here's Colegio Altamirano. It was founded in Hebronville, Texas, in the late 1890s, right? I found some evidence that it might have been 1895, it might have been 1897, but this photograph is from 1899. And here, Rosendo Barrera was the first head of school for Colegio Altamirano. And then here you can see the Mexican flag that they have. This is a photograph also of Colegio Altamirano from 1911. This woman here was Emilia Davila, and she taught at the school from 1910 to about 1916. And then for some reason she stopped for about 20 years, and then she started working there again in the 1930s and taught until her retirement in the like late 1950s, a little before the school closed. And this photograph is from 1915. Here's Emilia Davila again, and you could note the two flags and this obviously is from Colegio Altamirano. And so this would be an example of a formal escuelita, right? Where there's lots of evidence where the community in Hebronville pooled their resources together and they built a school, and the school lasted for over 60 years. And so this is the best that I could do in terms of showing you all an image of an informal escuelita. Multiple people that I interviewed talked about an escuelita in Mercedes, Texas, down in the valley, that started probably in the 1920s or 1930s, and it went until the 1960s. And the escuelita was run by a woman named Doña Albenita Garcia, and she was the aunt of Hector Garcia, who founded the American GI Forum. So this is his father, and he was a teacher in Tamaulipas. And I'm pretty sure the little textbook that his father wrote was used in his sister's escuelita. And so here's Hector Garcia here. And then here's his sister, Clotilda Garcia, also known as Dr. Cleo. And Rolando Hinojosa Smith, one of his siblings went to that school. So like many local histories, one of the things I do in my research is talk about how escuelita history of South Texas, and no doubt throughout the Southwest, but I focus on South Texas, is tied to much larger developments that took place not only in Texas, but across the United States. And also in Mexico as well. Like, and Chris mentioned these developments earlier: progressivism, modernization, the expansion of the public school system, and the Mexican Revolution. And connecting escuelitas to these historical developments, I argue, really highlights how these little schools tell us so much about how ethnic Mexicans negotiated their place in the United States, right? So when you have the proliferation of escuelitas, it points to this need that's not being met. And so the community is creating their own solution to overcome whatever obstacle is in their way to educating their children. And then when you have the decline of escuelitas, or the decline of escuelitas in that particular model that was alive for so many decades, then you have, it's an indication that that model, what that model was offering ethnic Mexicans is no longer relevant to their needs, right? And so I have a few other slides to go through. Let me share my screen again. And if we have time in the Q&A, we can go through some of them a little more thoroughly if you all would like to. But, you know, talking about progressivism, superintendent's reports in the late 19th century, looking at those remarks really speaks to the place that ethnic Mexican children and their families had in the earliest days of the public school system, right? Where here you have a superintendent from Maverick County basically complaining that they don't value education. And then he says, I beg to differ with you when it comes down to patriotism with these people who take all the benefits of our free school system and shout Viva Mexico. And here's another, another superintendent report where he says that if ethnic Mexicans are sending their children to school at all, it's only for the free daycare, right? It's only to avoid taking care of them. And once the Mexican Revolution ended, which Mexican Revolution was about 1910 to 1920, once the revolution ended, the Mexican consulate became much more involved in the state of their citizens in the United States, right? And part of their agenda was to try to support escuelitas. And to be clear, they didn't give them any money. It wasn't any kind of financial support. It was very much moral support, like, you're doing a good job, or you're doing a lot of good for Mexico coming back together and healing after the revolution. And so oftentimes members of the Mexican consulate would attend different events that escuelitas held, like different fundraisers or end of the semester exams, things like that, and often donated books and other materials to the schools. And so this is a letter that Moises Morales from Valentine, Texas, wrote to the Secretary of Foreign Relations in Mexico City, requesting materials for his escuelita. And he talks about the number of students that they have in their escuelita. He talks about the curriculum. He talks about the fact that he's trying to fulfill his duty as a good citizen of Mexico living in a foreign land. And so the records from this file show that the Mexican consulate did in fact approve his request, and they said that they would send a batch of books to Morales for this escuelita, but I was never able to find like what became of the escuelita beyond that, although my educated guess is that it did not survive the Great Depression for sure. So in 1921, you have ethnic Mexican men who begin organizing themselves on behalf of civil rights for Mexican Americans. And throughout the 20s, that culminates in the creation of LULAC, or the League of United Latin American Citizens, in 1929. And so ultimately, these Mexican American civil rights activists then convinced much of the Mexican and Mexican American population to enroll their children in the Texas public school system and to look to the United States as the foundation for their political and their civil rights. And additionally, they also convinced the Mexican consulate to abandon their support of escuelitas in favor of their pursuit for educational equality. So looking, oh, sorry. No, sorry, that was I don't know what's going on with my family. They're trying to call me right now at this point in time. So looking at these primary sources in the context of these larger historical developments really highlights that escuelitas then provided ethnic Mexicans with a solution to providing their children with an education, regardless of the obstacles that they were seeing, whether if the obstacle was the fact that a public school system wasn't there, hadn't quite expanded yet, hadn't reached their town yet, or whether the public school system did arrive and then had these very oppressive policies, Americanization, English only, things like that. But escuelitas then, beginning in the 1930s, you start to see that they go into decline, but they don't disappear completely. But at the same time, looking at the primary source evidence, you no longer see evidence of their proliferation, the fact that they exist in every corner of South Texas anymore. And even thinking about the documents that are in the Mexican Embassy's archive in Mexico City, they're an indication of this, right? So by 1930, the consulate, all the documents point to the consulate trying to help members of LULAC in support of their pursuit for educational equality. And the last document pertaining to their support of escuelitas in South Texas is 1927. And so one of the arguments that I make in the book is that escuelitas had a very significant impact on the Mexican-American campaign for educational equality, even beyond their decline in the post-World War II era, especially because many of those activists attended escuelitas when they were children. And another argument I make is that the historical narratives that were nurtured there, the narratives that were created and developed and nurtured were a predecessor to our modern day Mexican American Studies curriculum. So thank you. And thanks for your patience with my mother's constant calls.
Oh, thank you, Phyllis. That was great. Yes, I mean, the family does call when you're doing, they know exactly when to
My
call.
mother
So I'm gonna.
probably called my sister and tried to tell my sister to call me. Anyway.
Yes. So we're gonna go ahead and move on to our next speaker, which is Monica Munoz Martinez, and she is going to be speaking on the importance of oral history and that work. And so Monica is an associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, and the primary investigator for mapping violence, racial terror in Texas, 1900 to 1930, a digital research project that recovers histories of racial violence in Texas. In 2017, Martinez was selected for the prestigious Andrew Carnegie Fellows Program. The fellowship provided grants for the country's most creative thinkers to support research on challenges to democracy and international order. Martinez is also a leading public voice. She is a founding member of the Refusing to Forget Project, a nonprofit organization that calls for public reckoning with racial violence in Texas. She helped develop an award-winning exhibit for the Bullock, Texas State Historical Museum that marked the first time a cultural institution acknowledged state responsibility for a period of racial terror in the 20th century. She has also collaborated with the Texas Historical Commission to secure 4 historical markers along the US-Mexico border. And her research has been featured by many media outlets, including the New York Times, CNN, NBC, NPR, and the Associated Press. So I want to go ahead and welcome Monica Munoz Martinez. Dr. Martinez?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in the midst of so much upheaval, in the midst of a pandemic. I know that it's a trying time, so the fact that people are making an effort to be with us this evening is meaningful. I also want to thank Dr. Valenzuela for all of her work that she's done leading the movement to make sure that Mexican American Studies is available to children in Texas, to the work that Mr. Carmona has done in Donna that has been inspiring to me. And I think about the work that they've done, and I've said this in other places, but if I had access to the education that Mr. Carmona provides for his students and the curriculum that Dr. Valenzuela has advocated for, I think I would be a healthier person. I think we would live in a different world. And I'm really quite hopeful about what Texas will look like and what this world will look like if more people have access to Mexican American studies, ethnic studies, but the struggle continues. So I want to thank Dr. Carmona for bringing us all together. And I am going to speak a little bit about, I'm a historian of racial violence in Texas. I study the history of anti-Mexican violence in Texas. I've used oral history as a method of recovery to tell that history, because it's a history that's largely been forgotten or erased or misrepresented in institutional records. And so in my training in ethnic studies and in Mexican American studies as a historian, I was taught very early on by people like Vicky Ruiz and Matthew Garcia and other historians in Chicano studies and in ethnic studies, that to actually write these histories, it requires historians and scholars in the field to build the archives. And we actually have to do the work that institutions like libraries and museums fail to do, which is to record the stories of Mexican Americans and Tejanos in places like Texas. And so I want to talk really briefly about my own introduction to history, how I learned to think critically about what is being left out, and also talk about the value and importance of teaching students in K through 12 and in universities how to conduct oral histories, because we have so much more work to do, left to do, to recover a full record of our place here, but also of the important contributions. And Dr. Barragan's book is one of a crucial example of the important recovery work that's still ongoing. That not only helps to tell us important histories about education in Texas, but also helps to debunk myths, right, and racist stereotypes that Mexican American parents don't care about education or that Latino parents don't care about education. It actually teaches us this history of a long struggle for access to quality education. So I want to share a PowerPoint. See, here we go. Share. And introduce us to the theme for this presentation. I forgot to press play. I'm still learning the Zoom presentations. Okay, so to think about the relationship between history, power, and memory as one way of remembering the importance of thinking of the context for how hard this work is to do, and why it is that we have to rely on oral histories and recovering people's memories to contend with power and forces groups of people who don't want these histories not only to not be recovered, but also to not be taught. I grew up in Uvalde County, which is in the northern part of South Texas. It's actually east of the Rio Grande. It's a rural agricultural county. We do have a big HEB and a big Walmart, but we're also close to, people know about Uvalde County, also because of tourists who come for hunting, but also who go visit for floating down the Rio Grande, visiting Concan, but that's a place called home. In Uvalde County, there were photographs and paintings of this photograph that was published in the New York Times that said race unity was easy for Texas town. This was published in the New York Times in 1957. And it shows a young Anglo-American boy, an African-American boy, an Asian-American boy, and a Mexican-American boy raising up an American flag. And it's celebrating integrated schools in Uvalde, Texas. And so there was a painting of this photograph in the central office in Uvalde. And there later, when there was a new regional library built, a big mural of a recreation of this photograph. And so Uvalde really celebrates this moment of integration that was quite unique for Texas more broadly. But this was a sort of really interesting photograph because it didn't jive with the history of Uvalde as I had experienced it, but also as I had learned about it from family members. So what I had learned about from my parents and from aunts and uncles and family friends was about the Uvalde school walkouts that took place in 1970. So these were some of the photographs of, children, students walking out peacefully, protesting segregated schools in Uvalde, protesting the fact that these students were didn't have access to bilingual education, despite this being years after Brown v. Board of Education, despite this being years after the passage of the Bilingual Education Act. And so students and parents organized to walk out of the schools in Uvalde and demand their civil rights. But these students were grossly mischaracterized by the press, by the police, the Texas Rangers, and also by the local school boards. I'll talk a little bit about Crystal City later if I have time, but the Uvalde school walkouts were following in a larger movement during the Chicano movement of students who are walking out in protest of segregation and in protest of discrimination. The school board trustees in Uvalde, this group of all white men, did not respond to student and family demands and parent demands, and instead decided not to address any of the student concerns. The students submitted, I think, a list of at least 14 demands. And one of those demands was also that students wanted access to Mexican-American history, Mexican-American studies. They weren't calling it Mexican-American studies at the time, but they wanted to know about, they wanted to read literature, they wanted to read history. They wanted to learn about Mexican government, different forms, alternative forms of government. And so they were asking for ethnic studies and Mexican-American studies in 1970. But again, the press, the way that these students were represented, they were represented as militants, as communists. They were accused of having outside agitators coming to Uvalde. And you had Texas Rangers coming to the town and surveilling the students. And so the students themselves faced a lot of discrimination, and those who were seniors actually graduated without receiving school credit. Students who were sophomores and juniors lost a semester of credit. So that really disrupts this idea of, there being this racial unity in Uvalde in 1957. Those students, though, that had been so misrepresented in the historical record by the school board, by the press, were not communists and un-American. They were people like Elia Perez. This is her photograph from her high school yearbook. She was in the student council. She was a senior favorite. She was in the National Honor Society. Another senior, Oscar Castro, was a star football player. He was in the band. He was a class secretary. And there were also people like my mother, this is Maria Elena Munoz, who was an officer in the Spanish club. And my dad, I hope you can see him. He was a class favorite. He looks like a Mexican James Dean over here, Joe Martinez. But these were students who were active in student government, and they were exercising their constitutional rights to demand civil rights and to protest and to organize. But this history of student organizing and this history of this civil rights protest was completely erased from the public memory, the way that it was represented in the town. But people circulated accounts of this walkout at family barbecues. Parents told their children about it. And so that is what interested me in becoming a historian, recovering histories that had been erased or misrepresented, and making sure that new generations of students had access to these kinds of histories. I conducted oral histories with people who were involved in the movement, including family members, like my tia Olga Rodriguez, who was a secretary of the Mexican American Parents Association. I interviewed people like Genoveva Morales, who was a parent who not only was the president of the Mexican American Parents Association in Uvalde at the time, but she also sued the school district. Keeping in mind, remember that the school board members didn't actually implement any of the changes that parents and students were demanding. So she successfully sued the school district in 1976, Morales versus Channing and the UCISD. She won that court case. There was a federally mandated desegregation order that actually was in place until just a few years ago. Okay, so we think about how long the legacy of these efforts, students, Mrs. Morales was continuing to hold up challenges to the school district because of discrimination that was ongoing, but also making sure that students had access to things like bilingual education. The importance of oral history here is also, I want us to think about not just the role in preserving community memory, but these oral histories also introduced me to court cases like that by Genoveva Morales, but also other court cases that were filed across the country, right? And so this is a way as a historian of thinking, this isn't just, a small town racial dispute. it introduces you to a whole new legal history where you can find these cases where students or parents were organizing for civil rights. But unlike unlike in Crystal City, these not all of these efforts led to changes without legal action. I also just quickly wanted to say too, as a way of thinking about oral histories, that conducting oral histories with civil rights, people who participated in the civil rights movement in Uvalde and in South Texas also introduced me to the history of anti-Mexican violence in Texas. One of those interviews was with my uncle, Rogelio Munoz. And so he told me about the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez, who was lynched in Rock Springs in 1910. And he told me about the courthouse in Rock Springs, where every time he visited this courthouse, he remembered the tales that he was told, the story that he was told about the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez, which had taken place in 1910. It wasn't until years later in graduate school that I was conducting research on newspapers written in Laredo, Texas in the early 20th century that I found a newspaper article about the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez. And so in 2005, I learned about it from conducting an oral history. And then a couple of years later, I find the documentary evidence that actually this lynching did take place, that many of the details that had been remembered and preserved by the community were verified by the documentary evidence. And then it led me to actually a huge archive of newspaper articles, of investigations, of Mexican consulate investigations. And again, this is me trying to draw your attention to the importance of the history that's preserved in memory that then allows historians to actually go and do more work to uncover histories that have been erased or forgotten, but that there's lots of evidence to point us to. And I also want to say, that communities have preserved these histories and passed them on from generation to generation. And in many communities, people are still living with the tensions of how those histories are either told or misrepresented or silenced. So the case of the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez and many other cases that I wrote about in my book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, came about because I worked closely with community members, people across South Texas, to recover their family histories, but also to thankfully have access to the private archives, the papers and the photographs that they had in their homes. In collaboration with my colleagues in Refusing to Forget, we took on the work of working with descendants of racial violence to actually push for a public acknowledgement of this history of racial violence, but also to collaborate with state and cultural institutions to make sure that state institutions were doing some of the work of memorializing these histories and leading public conversations. So one of the great successes that started some of the momentum that we developed is that we had an exhibit at the Bullock Museum in 2016. It was called Life and Death on the Border in 1910 to 1920. It was a temporary exhibit, but while it was up for those 10 weeks, 40,000 people came to see the exhibit. And so that was just a very early example for us that we learned that there was so much interest and that public audiences were ready to have difficult conversations about Texas's past. This is a photograph Juan Bonilla Flores and his brother Narciso that was lent to the museum by the Alvarado family in Uvalde, Texas, that helped us tell the story of the Blood Creek Massacre, but also helped us put faces and names to some of the victims. And so this is some of that important recovery work that we were able to do thanks to the generosity of people like Benita Alvarado that had preserved her family archives. This was also an important moment for thinking about the importance of public education and making these kinds of histories available to the public. So Margaret Cook at the museum gave tours to teachers who came to learn about the history and also learn strategies for teaching the histories in the classroom. And it was really moving for me to have families come to the exhibit together because it really symbolized an opportunity for children to see on display histories that they had heard from family members but had not ever seen officially recognized. And so it was this moment where you started to see some of the decentering that Dr. Valenzuela mentioned, that we hope that these histories will stop being only Mexican American histories, but will become things like Texas history and US history. And so it was this moment where we could see the possibilities of working with the Bullock Museum. This is the picture of the Alvarados, and they were being interviewed by a journalist for Latino USA. We also worked with the Texas Historical Commission to unveil historical markers. This is the marker for Jesus Bazan and Antonio Longoria. This is Norma Longoria Rodriguez here, who helped introduce me to her family members and shared her private archive with me. We had big events in the Valley, but aside from the sort of 4 days of public history events for each of the marker unveilings, one of the important works that we did, this is Norma with her cousins and niece, they participated in the events and spoke on panels and have done more than historians have done to share these histories. But one of the things that we did was we organized a history harvest. And this was sort of the brainchild of Dr. Carmona, who said, you know, can you come and teach students at UTRGV how to conduct oral histories and digitize photographs? And so I worked with the archivists at UTRGV, both in Brownsville and Edinburgh, to host these history harvests to train students how to conduct oral histories, knowing the importance of that students that can make huge contributions. So some of the most important oral histories that I used in my book had actually been conducted by students in South Texas universities who conducted oral histories with relatives as assignments for their history classes. And so this is another photograph of our group. This is in Cameron County. Oh no, this is actually, I think, from the history harvest in Hidalgo County. You know, I just wanted to end because I want to save plenty of time for questions by also mentioning that we had a historical marker unveiled for Jovita Ibad, who was an educator. She was a suffragist. She was a fierce feminist. She worked for civil rights and social justice on both sides of the US-Mexico border. She lived sin fronteras. She was a journalist and left an incredibly important historical record for writing about these efforts, these social justice efforts in the early 20th century, for recording things like murders and lynchings. But she is not only a civil rights icon that we have helped to shine more light on, but the Refusing to Forget team worked, myself and students at Brown University worked together to develop a lesson plan on the life of Jovita Ibad. It's available for free on the Refusing to Forget website. I can put a link up in the chat. But one of the sort of gems of that lesson plan is that one of the assignments is it teaches, it instructs teachers on how to use oral history as an assignment that they can have in their K through 12 classrooms. And so, you know, so much of the work, I can stop sharing my screen now. So I wanted to say all of that to remind people that Mexican American studies is so incredibly important, ethnic studies is so incredibly important, but there's still so much more research to do. And so, you know, we can't do things like have a full reckoning with the history of anti-Mexican violence until we have a full record. We can't fully appreciate the contributions of Mexican Americans in the United States if we don't have a full record of all of their contributions. And so as the historian on the panel, my big pitch and takeaway is that we all have a lot within our own community memories, within our own family histories and community histories to preserve. And I hope, you know, that we'll have time in the Q&A to talk about some of the strategies that we can use to make sure that people in South Texas, across the country, participate in preserving the histories of marginalized groups that have been neglected and overlooked because they have important histories to tell. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Monica. That was a really great presentation. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our last speaker for tonight before we open it up for Q&A. So I just want to go ahead and say that if you have questions or thoughts, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and we can get to them after this presentation. If not, we can just open up with the questions that are here. So our last presenter is Juan P. Carmona. He's a social studies teacher at Donna High School and a dual enrollment history instructor through South Texas College, and is the Donna High School Social Studies Department head. He graduated with honors from the American Military University with a master's degree in American history and has been teaching Mexican American history for dual enrollment for the past 6 years. He was the recipient of the 2018 James Finega Outstanding Teaching Humanities Award by the Humanities Texas, and is a member of the Texas Focal Committee for Mexican American Studies in K through 12, and the Social Studies Coordinator for the Rio Grande Valley Coalition for Mexican American Studies. His primary field of research is the history of the South Texas borderland, and he is also the author of the book, The Alton Bus Crash. So he will go ahead and be speaking about teaching racialized violence in the public school system. Go ahead.
I thank Chris. And first of all, I'd like to thank the previous speakers. I know like Monica and Angela, and I was a lot of the work I do and what I'm going to talk about and show has a lot to do with the refusing to forget, and some of the presentations they've given and invited my students to present as well, those presentations. And that's kind of led me down the path of some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. But yeah, I want to thank Angela for all her work, and Phyllis, I'm really interested in reading your book, because in the end, the way we're going to change society and change things is through education. And then it's not, and one thing we have to start with is it's nothing new. We've always sought education. It's just not always been given to us. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can show you a PowerPoint and be a little easier for me to talk about what I'm going to talk about. So let me see how to get it. There we go. Let me just put it to present. Okay. Alrighty, so I'm gonna embarrass Chris right now. And I was looking for a picture of me when I was a child, and I was like, hey, look, there's Chris too. And this is the perfect presentation to embarrass Chris. and there's a point to showing this. When I grew up, and when Chris grew up, and there's our sister Jessica as well. I never knew anything about Men's American Studies. I didn't realize at the time when I was going through the school system that I was literally taught to hate myself and my identity. I didn't like people who spoke Spanish. I didn't speak Spanish. And there was a lot of things that I was just never aware of. And I was thinking I was living in a good world, perfect world. America was nice. And, not really realizing I was erasing my identity. And it was interesting when earlier I heard Monica point this out, and I've heard it so many people, that like the only place we ever actually got our real history was usually at a barbecue. We were usually hanging out, and we would listen to our grandparents and our parents and so forth. And that was Mexican American Studies for us. And so, that's completely swallowed by day-to-day U.S. history that you see on TV, that you see in movies, that you see, then you're learning in school. It's just completely obliterated. You'll hear those stories, and they're nice little stories, but you never put them in the realm of actual history, at least not in my head, not until I go to school and really learn my own history. And so, in learning, I learned the one major lesson I learned is I can't, abide by my, children feeling how I felt when I finally really learned my history, and I finally really learned what had been done to me, and I really learned how the educational system had been set up in such a way for me to completely erase my identity or forget who I was, because the person they were trying to create wasn't me. It was someone that they wanted, and it was never really me. And so when I really learned who I was, really learned my history, then I really dove deep into it, and went back to school. I worked in healthcare for 15 years before I even became a teacher. went back to school for history, went back and got my master's. And with this passion that I wanted to teach the kids what was never taught to me. Because afterwards I felt a certain pride I had never felt in my life. And you can see some of the pictures here. And like I was saying earlier, a lot of this work, is in tandem with refusing to forget. But really, it starts even before that in my classes. And the whole and this actually, in speaking to Angela, I was talking to Emilio, and it was like when I had about to start teaching Mesoamerican history, there was a conference in the summer, and I was talking to Emilio, and he's the one who gave me the idea of oral histories. And we had a conversation, and that has sprung everything I've done since then. But really, what's public history? And I just yanked the definition off, of a public history website. And I like the way it says the use of historical skills and methods outside of traditional academic realm of history. Public historians use their training to meet the needs of the community, the public, whether that community is defined as a city, neighborhood, business, or historical society. And one thing, like Monica pointed out, is, and even Angela, this is a new discipline. Mexican American Studies, Chicano Studies, all this is a new discipline. And because it's new, in the sense, we have to become our own historians. And one of the proudest things I've in my life is an event that I'll talk about in a bit, but the fact that, not only do we need to record our stories, we need to share our stories. It's one thing to sit down and interview people, but it's another thing to take that stuff and give it back to the public and allow them to also open their stories as well. A lot of times, one of the things that came out of doing oral histories, and I've said this many times, but it just points to the power of it. On my first mosque class, I went to a conference, and they asked my students what was the biggest thing that came out of it, and one of them said, "My grandmother talks to me more now." And it's after she did the oral history, and really justified her life and validated her life. And this is what public history can do. This is what, not only recording histories, but cataloging them and then presenting them back to the community to say their stories matter. They are a part of the story of this great nation of Mexico, America, and just us as well. And our culture, is something worthy of study. And on top of that, as a teacher, this is the best way to get kids really into learning. It's the best way to really get them to do research, and they don't even realize they're doing research. And so, like, what I usually start my year with, because this is the class is Mexican American 1, Mexican American History 2, which is basically the same time period as U.S. history. So, but when the first semester is always around the other semester, so this is how I start them in learning their own history. And so we start with, like, you'll find a relative. Someone who passed away in your family that you may or may not know of. Now, sometimes, it's a great thing to honor someone that they did recently lose or, lost in their lives. But, and that's a great thing to do. But also I tell them it's even, another thing is to learn someone you never knew. A great uncle, great grandfather, great mom. And here, they don't realize they're doing historical work. They don't realize that they're researching their family. They're just like, oh, I'm talking about grandma. I'm talking about, and not even realizing that they're already started the path of doing historical research in a little project that doesn't seem like much, but it's much more than that little thing that they are holding. And not only did they research it and learn it, they shared it with their class. So now that story goes back to its community. And so that story now stays with 30 more kids and so forth. And so, we've gone on, and I always have my kids, if we can, go present their oral histories at conferences. One, it gives them confidence, but once again, shares their stories. Shares the stories of our particular community, especially if these conferences are outside the Rio Grande Valley, because everyone's experiences are a little different. And here they are presenting the Knox de Hasfoco. And once again, not even realizing that they're doing real research. Like, they're just like, oh, I'm just interviewing my mom and I'm writing a little thing, but this is, they don't, make that connection till a little later in class. I'm like, okay, you know how you did that? All you're going to do is research this the same way. And then that led me to, like, really producing oral history and community history. And we did this through a competition, Texas History, National History Day. That first group on the left, the very first group I tried it out with, I'd never done it before, but it was just an idea. One of the kids threw around, we just started talking. They're all my debaters, so we always would sit around and just talk. my debate practices would be like an hour and a half and 30 minutes of debate. But anyway, so we got into this conversation about doing this. So they actually won the Regional History Award, and they did a documentary on the Ed Couch Elsa walkouts. Um, and this other group on the right is that actually has three different projects. All of them went to state, and that's they did a project on the Matanza, which was a short, also a video documentary on it. Another one did a historical reenactment. And the other group of kids did a presentation of the FAR riots. And there you see them. They earned 8th place in the competition, so there's their medals. And it's some of these same girls that I would later use to also um, recreate some of the testimony from the Canales Commission when they were investigating the Texas Rangers. And it started off in the first presentation in Brownsville when they put up the marker to Matanza in 1915. And I wanted my kids to participate, so I asked if they could, and they're like, oh, come up with different presentations. And I was just brainstorming with the kids, let's do this, let's do that. And it just popped in my head, hey, you guys want to look through the testimony, which is like thousands of pages long, and see if you find something interesting that maybe we could read to the people there. And you would be surprised, like the stuff these kids could find. I don't know how they find it. I think if I sat there by myself, I probably wouldn't have found half the stuff they found. I put them in groups, they skimmed through it. And honestly, the first time we did that, I wasn't even paying attention to what was going on. I was just making sure the kids going on and off stage, doing everything, not paying attention and not coming to the realization of what they had just done. And it wasn't, and I think it was you, Monica, but I could be wrong, who said something to the fact that these words had not been uttered since 1919. And then I looked to the audience and I really realized the impact. So we did this another time. And then when the conference, the 100th anniversary, the Canales Commission conference, they did it there in Austin. And I want to, in one thing is for me to talk about it. And, there's the actual volumes of testimony that, they were searching through. Of course, it was digitally, they weren't going through that. And I wanted to show you, it's one thing to talk about it, but these are the kids that actually presented, and I asked them to tell me, like, how did it feel to do what they did? And some of them did the documentary and presentations, and some just did the presentations. And Valeria is the one who did the dramatic interpretation that everyone liked. She said, being part of a group that promotes the spread of Latino history is one of my proudest moments. I was able to take part in it by performing a reenactment of the testimony, and just seeing the impact it created made me realize the importance of this material. Not only did I feel more connected to my history and roots, but I finally found a piece of history that belonged to my people, and I was able to learn about it. And here's Simone Morin. Actually, she would told me that her grandmother was helping to bury some of the bodies that they found that were lynched. Yeah, when we were doing the project, she was just mentioning to her grandmother what she was doing. She had no idea that her grandmother had that story. But anyway, she said, working on our documentary, La Matanza of 1915, and performing testimonies had such a big impact on me. I feel such a greater connection to my ancestors. I remember talking to my grandma about it and thinking, wow, there's so much more to us than we think. Even after all this time, I continue to educate myself and educate others about our history. And Araceli Zamora, another participant, wrote, being able to tell the stories of those who lost their lives at the hands of the Texas Rangers felt like we were able to give them the respect they deserve. Their history had been silenced for far too long. I feel enlightened as I'm able to know and spread the history of my people and what we have gone through. And finally, Alondra Chapa, excuse me. Well, it was an amazing opportunity to make something on our own about history that had yet to be explored, history that was to be buried away. Educating ourselves, our classmates, those who weren't even aware of the RGB's existence was so rewarding. I will never forget saying the names of the victims when I was at the podium. She actually read the names of those from the Porvenir massacre. Finally, feeling as if their pain was being heard. I've never been prouder of any piece of work like that documentary. We got caught up in our history books that we forget that there is so much more to be discovered. So much history that is hidden in La Matanza of 1915 is just the tip of the iceberg. And as long as we refuse to forget, then we can continue to bring light to the history that has been hidden away, but always holds just as much importance. And this is like the words from the kids. And honestly, I get a little emotional when I think about what we had done. And this thing, just make connections. I mean, one, it gives cultural pride and racial pride, but it also just, gets them involved in the education in ways that they most people wouldn't normally do. Earlier I said, I heard Angela, point to a social studies, and it hit me. Where is the social in our social studies? I'm the social studies department head. Anyway, we do world geo, world history, U.S. government, but it's all like, just basic facts and this and that, but no real cultural history. And where's our cultural? And, this is what this helps create and brings back to the community. And I'm so proud of the work I've done with those students. And I'll go ahead and in there. Let me get out of this thing. So I'll go ahead and end my presentation there.
All right.
Chris,
Well,
can I
thanks.
say something before you
Yeah,
open
go
it up to
ahead.
questions? Yeah,
Go
I mean,
ahead.
I think one of the things that's so incredible too about Mr. Godwina's, the work that he's done with the students, and he didn't mention this, but in one of the photographs that he showed from students that participated in the Canales conference at the Bullock Museum, is there was a photograph of him with Benita Alvarado and Maria Alvarado, who are, Benita Alvarado is a descendant of the Blomedy massacre. She's the descendant, who has helped, she is one of the descendants of Blomedy massacre who has helped preserve the history, but who's been working for decades to make sure that the history of Blomedy was not forgotten, and that actually there was a public accounting of it. And for her to be able to witness these high school students reading the testimonies of Juana Flores was just one. I didn't know that was going to happen. The descendants didn't know that was going to happen. And it was one of these moments where you really saw that the students had read through the Canales hearings, found those testimonies, been moved by them, and then publicly performed them. It was one of the unintentional, beautiful outcomes of having Mexican American studies curriculum, introducing it to students, and then asking students, what is that you think is important to teach to a public audience? And it was a really moving event. And so I'm so grateful for his teaching and for the contributions that his students have made. I'll also say, as another note, that when the students presented in Brownsville in 2017, they did primary source research and they made presentations at the conference that we hosted. And some of the documents that the students presented, the historians in the room had never seen, right? So it again is celebrating the important work that students can contribute to the field of history, but to Mexican American studies, and to really honoring the work that they can do as scholars. And Dr. Godwina has just given us a beautiful model of what that can do.
Thank you, Monica.
I just want to thank you, Monica, because I put that picture there specifically to say that, and I don't know why I forgot, because I remember walking off the stage and she was there and she was talking with my student. That's why the picture occurred, is they were hugging her and talking to her, and it was a beautiful moment, like you said. And I put that picture there to remind me to say it, and I don't know why I forgot. But thank you, Monica, for reminding me about that.
Yes. Well, thank you guys for that exchange there. I wanted to go ahead and start going to jump into the Q&A session of this. And I want to go ahead and start with Sonia Aleman. You have the first question if you want to go ahead and talk about your question. Sonia, you with us? I don't know if she still is.
Yes,
I'll go ahead and read.
yes, I am.
Are you? Okay, go ahead.
So we're just, as Monica was going through her presentation, remembering when we went to the Bullock Museum to see that exhibit and with our family several years ago, and remembering the impact that it had on us. We went specifically to see that exhibit, took our kids, and just wondering whatever happened to that, if it's still publicly available, what kind of permanent home it might have.
Well, we still have, the Bullock Museum we have been working with Refuse to Forget to try to raise funding to turn it into a traveling exhibit. So there's some fundraising that has to happen, but also I think what we should do really is just turn it into a digital exhibit until we can raise the funds to make it travel. I don't think that it will become a permanent exhibit unless we can find an institution that wants to host it. I mean, the objects especially that were on display were lent but we could still have a version of it that I think could travel. So the idea after the exhibit was up, there were over 20 libraries or museums or institutions that wanted to host it. It was just one of these examples that, we didn't know how to do the fundraising, and we were my colleagues, Sonia Hernandez, Trini Gonzalez, Ben Johnson, and John Moran Gonzalez. We were all contributing to Refusing to Forget, like in our part, like on the side, our full-time jobs. So I'm thankful that you asked that question, because it's a reminder that we need to pick that back up. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we have a question here from Marlon. If you want to go ahead and ask your question, Marlon.
The actual name is Mario. Can you hear me?
Oh, Mario. Yes, we can hear you, Mario.
I just put it with the first two letters of the first name and then the last name. Thank you very much for the opportunity. You have to also forgive me. I'm not tech savvy because of my age. Oh, that's not an excuse. And if I make some mistakes, and say, for example, in maybe some of the notes that I try to, some of the questions I ask and so forth, just bear with me. I'll learn as I go along. The question I had was directed for Phyllis Barragan. It was a very good presentation, well researched, nonetheless. And the way you described the curriculum that was used in that first escuelita reminds me of my junior class at Cal State Northridge, where we got into Chicano studies, and I got a degree in Chicano studies back in 1974, and those same classes or those same subjects you addressed were basically part of that Chicano studies curriculum. Okay? And we're talking about what's the span of years there between that escuelita and then in 1974 in a very remote and all-white neighborhood in Los Angeles. Okay? Quite interesting, and also maybe significant in terms of maybe that should be the basic curriculum for Chicano studies. I have not had a chance. I'm just now joining the movement, as I call it. I'm a researcher and a writer. I just have a couple of books that I've had published, but they deal in the sports field. I look at my people, the Mexicanos that have gone. That's the one aspect that I focused on, and also in the military. I'm a 1968 Vietnam War veteran. When I came home from the war, my folks had moved to Los Angeles, and I went to Los Angeles and got to school there. Okay, and there's where I got the harsh realization of who I was in terms of my identity. I was pretty much lost there back in the 60s. We were still called wetbacks and chili chompers and all this other stuff and so forth. We got along with that as best we could. There was a lot of violence back then, but those were the times. This is where that oral history that Monica Martinez refers to. Okay, we need to document all that stuff, all that information, all those individuals, but we have to identify them first. See, that was a very good point. And in yours on the Chicano studies, that is quite a and I lack the words to describe how important that description you gave of a curriculum would be today and in the future. Okay, our efforts have to be united. There's no denying that. When in listening to Monica, when she talks about this information, this oral history has to be captured, and it has to be not only documented but also published, made a matter of record for everybody to read. Okay? And only until that is done or accomplished, we're going to have some victories here and some losses here and so forth. But that should not discourage us from pushing on. Both presentations were excellent. Very informative, and I can tell they were very well researched. Because I pride myself in digging up stuff that no one else would ever think of digging up, and then giving it a perspective. My doctoral training was in English. I was taught to be a literary critic, so I use a lot of theory in the writings and the essay writings that I do: critical race theory, cultural theory, of course some of the other theories that are available to us, which I can't put my words to it at this point. But I support each and every one of you, Mr. Carmona. You're an inspiration. your influence on the kids is remarkable and is quite noticeable. Continue to do that.
Thank you. Phyllis, do you want to go ahead and
Thank you for
respond?
the opportunity for me to speak a little bit.
Yes,
Thank you.
definitely. Phyllis?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Mario, for coming, and thank you so much for your question. So the Colegio Altamirano, which was the first escuelita that I mentioned, I think that's probably the one that you're referring to.
Yeah.
It didn't close until 1958, so it lasted a good long while. Now I think in the 1950s the numbers were really dwindling quite a bit, so which is why eventually the school had to close because so few students were attending at that point. But I mean, yeah, I think you're right, and it's something that I found too in my research, this definite connection between the curriculum of those late 19th, early, first half of the 20th century escuelitas and a lot of the demands that Chicano student activists were making in the 1960s and the 1970s. And in fact, one of my a scholar, Dr. Francisco Hernandez, got his PhD at Stanford. At Stanford, the same time that Dr. Guadalupe San Miguel was there, and I think they were friends at the time. He did a research project while he was a grad student at Stanford on escuelitas in the Southwest, and he was kind enough to share an interview with me that he had done with Dr. Jose Limon back in the 1970s, and he sent me his paper. But after he graduated, or while he was a graduate student in California, he helped develop some kind of alternative school programs for Chicano students in California, and drawing like a very similar curriculum, right? Focused on Mexican history, Mexican cultural traditions. And more scholars now are starting to do work making those connections a lot more concrete. So Dr. San Miguel, at the end of one of his books, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of which book it is, but in one of his chapters, he talks about those connections. There's a recent graduate from University of Houston, Dr. Carlos Cantu, who has done a lot of research on like Chicano schools during the Chicano movement and making connections with the curriculum of the escuelitas as well.
Thank
One
you.
thing is very crucial, the underlying, the basis of all this, okay, that type of curriculum will build an identity. Usually when a Chicano or a Mexican American or Latino, whatever they wish to call themselves, will take a Chicano studies course, they more than likely, I would say 90% of the time, and I say that very easily, is that they really don't know who they are. They have an idea. Okay? That's why the curriculum is going to be so important. Okay, if you have Mexican ancestry, then you're way ahead of everybody else because you're now if you're born in Texas, you've got two cultures, two languages, two histories, two types of poetry, two types of linguistic subjects and that sort of stuff. And the thing is, but they need to be taught that. They sometimes will catch that along the way during the process. That is, if the process is continuous. Okay? Chicano studies has to be a continuous process for it to be effective. You know? You get the who call themselves a Chicano or Mexicano and so forth. You don't even know where Mexico City is. He doesn't speak Spanish, and if he does speak Spanish, it's broken. You know, they oftentimes will make fun of that and so forth, but eventually that just tells you they're deficient, and those are the areas that need to be addressed. The identity has to be affixed first, or developed, or a foundation based first, so they can absorb all the rest of the stuff that comes along. History, for example. I love history. You know, I was in high school. I could name every single battle of the American Revolution, who the general was and what the casualty rate was. Okay? But if you ask me about the anything with the U.S.-Mexican War, U.S. and Mexican War, couldn't tell you a darn thing. Why? Because I didn't get that in school. Okay? I spoke Spanish at home, and the abuelitas were always the centerpiece of the family. Okay? Everything evolved around that one lady or that one lady and then one man. Okay? And you would learn from your grandfather by just sitting next to him and him talking to friends and so forth. Okay, that's that old history that Monica refers to. That's important. And these are the things that have to be brought and mentioned to the students in their, I should say, their overview of what to expect when she comes to. There are many things, and it develops identity. There's a current book right now. It's called Identity Leadership. It was written by the boyfriend of Oprah Winfrey. It just came out in 2019. I did a book review on it. And he talks about that identity helps you develop your leadership. He's Black. So his perspective comes from the Black growing up in whatever area he grew up in. Okay? It's a very good book. It's well written and it's simple to understand. And then the rest of the book gives you a lot of examples, including Oprah, as to how that leadership develops. Once you become a leader, then basically there's no holding you back. So that's another thing, another emphasis that has to be made in this teaching process to get these young chicaneros, the young chicaneas and so forth, going on not learning just one thing but several things, and then becoming a master of who they are. And that will eventually will get us to a point. I'm probably not going to see that, but it's something that has to get started. But that was a very, very well done for the presentation, and I thank you for it.
All right, thank you, Mario. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question from Carla. Carla, you're still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
So the question was going to be for Monica.
Mm-hmm.
The question was just simply asking, do you think it's important just to search up every little missing detail about Mexican American history? As in, we have to look into the books. We need to look into the archives of every library.
I think yes. Well, on the one hand, we still have, as I said before, we still have a lot of recovery work that we have to do. But we also have to reconsider the archives that exist. And so, for the writing of my book, I did have to rely on institutional archives as well. And so that meant when I was researching in records that were kept by the Texas Rangers, for example, I used methods in ethnic studies that taught me not always to be critical and to read some of those records against the grain. And so what that meant was, for example, if a Texas Ranger reported on shooting a prisoner in their custody, they oftentimes didn't give the names of the people who were their prisoners in their custody. And also, they would accuse these, in some cases, people of trying to resist arrest. And so because I had done enough research on this period and on these policing tactics, it was, in my training in ethnic studies, right, they taught me the longer history of police violence in the Southwest and in Texas. It helped me to read those archives against the grain, meaning I didn't automatically give that source full authority as a record of truth. And many of the cases that I researched, I actually found out, in the case of the Bloody Beach Massacre, for example, the Texas Ranger reports were false. And some Texas Rangers changed their account many times of events. And so I think that what you're pointing to is the need to not only recover more Mexican American histories, but also that we have to use what we learn from these histories to also reevaluate institutional records that for too long have been given full authority. And it has meant that the histories that have been written, especially about racial violence, that many historians got them wrong or misrepresented what was taking place. And the consequences of that misremembering of this history has had devastating consequences. It meant that violence and policing continued well after the 19-teens. It meant that people who were victims of police shootings or violence, that many of their names still haven't been recovered because of reports that said, Mexican bandit shot while resisting arrest. And so yes, we have a lot more work to do, but again, the part of the important conversation here is that this is important US history, it's important Texas history, it's important history of the borderlands. And so it's not only important, it is vitally important for Mexican Americans and Tejanos, but it's important for everybody in the United States to learn this history, especially now when we're thinking about the kinds of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies, the kinds of violence against people who were seeking refuge in the United States. It's important for us to learn from this history, from the historical lessons, so that we don't repeat them. And we can only fully learn from the history if we have a full record.
Thank you, Monica. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to Stephanie Rodriguez. Stephanie, are you with us?
I am.
Okay.
I guess my question is mainly, with new teachers coming in, like I recently graduated with my bachelor's in history. And so I guess, how do you incorporate like the dynamics of, your history and your curriculum? I think it's easy for us to be open in South Texas because we're such a diverse community. However, what do you say in places that only focus on, like the standardized areas, rather than expanding those ideas because it's not, relevant to them?
Are you asking like in an area that's maybe all like Anglo or something? Would you still teach this? Is that what you're asking, or are you just asking how to engage?
I think just how would we go about that? Because I know, when you have like a full curriculum and you have to teach certain areas, just how do you incorporate it like in your classroom?
Oh, you mean like EOC tested areas, stuff like that? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay. Well, to begin with, like when you look at the TEKS, there are tons of research and writing TEKS. And all this stuff is easily transferable to those TEKS. And years ago, when I first got into this movement, we actually wrote like curriculum for our Mexican American Studies class. And what I ended up doing is I looked at US history TEKS and I highlighted those that it covered. And it was over 70% of US history TEKS, because we're talking about the same eras and the same things, but we're just adding more perspective to it. So sometimes when I talk about like, why should we teach this? It's giving kids like more information about, certain topics that are tested, but it also, they have a vested interest in it because it is their culture and they probably have never heard these stories before. And so they wake up when you hear, they hear, certain people that are in their culture, then you attach it to, the Great Depression, or you attach it to different things. So that's one way of doing it. And one thing I'll add is, even if you had an area where maybe, there weren't that many Mexican Americans, a lot of times we think that, history is just that one thing that you study, and it's US history or whatever. But, there's something that comes with learning other cultural histories as well. I remember one of the things when I was an undergrad that I wanted to learn was Russian history, because I grew up in the 80s. It was the Cold War. I wanted to learn about other people. And there's nothing wrong about learning about other people. In fact, it makes you understand them better. And maybe we'll not see, people in these little boxes of enemies and stuff like that once we start to really understand different cultures. So there's something to be said about just studying different cultures in general. But as far as Mexican American history, there's a lot of stuff that you can coincide and will align with the TEKS and help maybe reinforce certain tricks that the kids will remember now, because that now it was something that they have a vested interest in, especially when you're looking more modern history. And if they're doing oral histories and stuff, I'm sure their parents and grandparents have lived through things that they're going to learn in US history. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to go into Mark Molina. Mark Molina, you have a question? Mark, are you still with us?
Yes, I am, and thank you all for putting this together. I was curious if Dr. Barragan Getz or Dr. Munoz Martinez encountered any tensions within the Mexican American community, in either in their education efforts or in these efforts to remember the violence, because this is obviously both the areas that you're dealing with. There's heavy agricultural production going on, and sometimes these efforts go kind of against the social, norms of the area. So I was just curious if you guys found any of that and how it might be relevant to, continuing issues, within the Chicano community about, where we stand on trying to put these into curriculum.
I can answer really quickly. Well, I mean, absolutely, yes. So I think that, on the one hand, I'll say that, even if we teach to look back at the history of the early 20th century, to the era when people like Jovita Edad were organizing and hosting conferences, civil rights conferences like El Primer Congreso Mexicanista in Laredo. She was advocating for calls for social justice that didn't align with the work and advocacy of people like J.T. Canales, Jose T. Canales, who was the state representative who ended up from Brownsville, who ended up filing the investigation to the Texas Rangers in 1919. So, for example, Jovita Edad, organized that conference with people who were Mexican nationals and who lived in Nuevo Laredo. When J.T. Canales and others went on to organize LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, the organization was closed to people, Mexican nationals, people who did not have American citizenship. And so I think that that's an important, I bring up those two people when I'm teaching classes so that students know, right, that part of learning Mexican American history is learning it in all of its diversity and learning all of the different threads that continued throughout the 20th century, that you had people like Emma Tenayuca, who was a labor organizer in the 1930s and 40s, and who had a completely different politics to people like Jose T. Canales. And still today, you have a wide range of Latino politics and Latinx politics playing out on the national scale in politics, but also in community politics. And so I think that part of the work that we have to do, and this is why it's so hard when the opportunity to teach Mexican American history, Mexican American studies are so narrow, is that that it can seem, we have to decide who we're teaching, and if we only have, like one teaching module to teach Mexican American history from the 19 teens, teachers have to decide who is it that we pick to choose to teach the students about. And so that really is why I'm advocating for, and I think other people are advocating for, the need for more curriculum so that students get a sense of the breadth, so that they can find themselves in different kinds of people, not just in the only individuals that might have the opportunity to be highlighted. So that's one thing I'll say about teaching the history. And then just really quickly about the descendants of racial violence in the early 20th century, there have been disagreements, different interpretations of what should happen, like what does memorialization look like? And so, again, there are some descendants who think that that there should be a state apology. There are others who think that descendants should receive indemnities or reparations. Some are seeking access to land that their relatives were violently displaced from. And some say, having a historical marker is all that we need. And so again, I think part of the recovery and memorialization work really requires having broader conversations with people and working for memorialization at different levels. It has to be multifaceted, recognizing that there's going to be disagreements and people have different interpretations of what healing can look like. But it's an important question. Thanks. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Monica. Phyllis, do you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Mark, for your question. And building on what Dr. Martinez just said, you see those tensions throughout Escuelita history as well. So even in the early part of the 20th century, 1903, 1904, 1906, you have members of the Spanish language press in South Texas in different cities in the region, like Alice, Texas, and Laredo, where they're publishing articles and they're having this very public discussion about the need for escuelitas, this debate, right? And you have a couple of the presses saying that the ethnic Mexican community in South Texas needs escuelitas, they need this curriculum. And then you have the other two saying they're completely irrelevant because we're in the United States, and they didn't understand like why the escuelitas were still even there. So even in the early era, you have those tensions, and you have those pretty intense discussions and debates taking place. And then even further into the 20th century, after World War II, one of the things that the last chapter in my book looks at is the influence that escuelitas of the earlier era had on the Mexican American civil rights advocates, right, in the post-World War II era. And so I look at some Mexican American civil rights activists like Felix Tijerina, who was drawing from the escuelita model in terms of creating this alternative educational space that operated outside the public school system, and using that space to teach ethnic Mexican children English before they attended the first grade, right? To try to change the children to meet the requirements, so to speak, of the system. And that then there were other Mexican American activists of that same time that weren't really drawing from the escuelita model anymore, but they were definitely drawing from the curriculum and trying to integrate that escuelita curriculum into the master narrative that was being taught in the public school system. So the way I interpret it was, you have some activists who are saying we need to prepare the children, and then you have other activists who are saying we need to change the system, right? So those tensions, even within escuelita history, have always been there.
Thank you. So we have one last question, and then we're going to go ahead and end this. From Enrique Aleman, do you want to go ahead and this is for you, Phyllis. So Enrique.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the panel. This has been great, and I want to say hi to my profe, Dr. Valenzuela, who was on my dissertation committee, and has always been such a great inspiration to the work that we're doing here in San Antonio and across South Texas. My question was really about if the escuelita movement. My mother-in-law, Sonia's mom, went to an escuelita in Cotulla, Texas, in the 1950s, and her grandmother, her dad's mom, is from Hebronville. She was one of several sisters that we were just talking right now. She graduated from high school she was born in 1923. So your work is very relevant to our community and to our family. And so the question was the escuelita movement more of a South Texas phenomenon, or you mentioned Southwest, the Southwest region, but how prevalent was it across the Southwest, or was it predominantly a Tejano kind of South Texas kind of phenomenon that really kind of took root here and really grew as a movement? And thank you all for all your work. It's very inspirational.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aleman, for your question. Without a doubt, escuelitas were firmly rooted or entrenched in South Texas in the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century, for sure, without question. When I first started my dissertation, I was going to write this huge book about escuelita history in all of the Southwest. And I did find instances, evidence of escuelitas in Arizona. I interviewed a woman in Tucson who attended an escuelita there in the 1930s. I mentioned before the work of Dr. Francisco Hernandez in the late 70s, early 80s. And in his research, he identified several escuelitas that were in California. So I have no doubt that they existed throughout the Southwest. But beyond that research that I did when I first started the project, I don't know like to what extent, because maybe almost a year into my project is when I narrowed it down to Texas.
All right. Thank you, Phyllis. And I want to thank all of my panelists for being here today and taking part in this. And I think we had some great questions and we had a great panel. So we are recording this event, and we will be putting it up on YouTube probably tomorrow or Friday at the latest. So I just want to go ahead and say thanks to everybody, and thank you guys and everybody who attended. And you guys have a good night and stay safe. Thank you guys.
Buenas noches.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.